Did you ever wish you could just use a time machine to go back to the 80s and play all of the classic retro video games? Sure, most people would use a time machine for more important things, but we're all gamers here, so I know that's what we'd use it for. Luckily, we don't have to create our own flux capacitor because we got emulation. Through emulation, we've seen something of a retro gaming revival lately. But it's important to know the rules of emulation.
First rule of Fight Club is...
don't talk about emulation because part of it is, technically, illegal. Who am I kidding? This video is all about emulation. So let's kick things off by talking about the history of emulation. Before it was the norm to have at least one computer in your house, emulation was never even a thought because, well, there was nothing you could run an emulation program on. But things changed in 1990 with the Family Computer Emulation V0.35. It was a program created by Haruhisa Utagawa for the FM Towns, which was a Japanese variant of PC intended to play games. The emulator was only able to run simple NES games like Donkey Kong, but it was the first big step towards full emulation. Once traditional PCs gained more popularity in the mid-90s, we saw emulation truly take off. Computers were getting more powerful, internet speeds were getting faster, and we had a higher number of quality emulators available for download. One of the most popular emulators at the time had to be ZSNES, which was able to play, you guessed it, Super Nintendo games. It was one of the first emulators to have NetPlay, allowing you to play multiplayer games with others online. The SNES itself didn't even have this feature. Over time, we've seen more and more emulators capable of doing some incredible things. Some allow for ROM hacks, allowing you to use cheats and even speed up or slow down time in games with very long cutscenes or dialogue scenes. Nowadays, pretty much every console that has ever existed, even the most obscure ones you could think of, have emulators. It has sure come a long way over the last 30 years. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows in the world of emulation. As with anything free, you have to ask yourself, is this too good to be true? The answer for emulators is kinda. You see, emulation itself is completely legal. You're allowed to download the programs on your computer and run them. The issue comes with the games, known as ROMs, because it's illegal to download them and play them on an emulator. Yeah, it's weird. Emulators are okay, but due to copyright issues, downloading games for your emulator is not. The laws just make so much sense. Seriously though, I could understand why video game companies, especially Nintendo, want to crack down on piracy and emulation. They want gamers to experience their games the way it was intended, through the original console using the original games. Also, if emulation isn't an option, that means those who are selling their NES, SNES, or N64 will get a higher return on their sale. Well, at least there's one positive from all this. Due to all this, it's very difficult to find Nintendo ROMs online nowadays. But if you already downloaded a bunch of Nintendo ROMs, then you're in luck and have nothing to worry about. Luckily, it's still quite easy to download ROMs on consoles not made by Nintendo. Sega Genesis emulators like the Genesis Plus GX are very popular because their games are easy to find and run super well. Now let's get back to the positives. Earlier I mentioned that due to emulation, we've seen a bit of a retro gaming revival, and truer words can't possibly be spoken. Although there are undoubtedly some legal issues when it comes to emulation, it's a great way to experience the classic games in video game history. In fact, I would say it's the best way to play retro games. You don't need to fork out hundreds of dollars on a console and a handful of games. Instead, you just download a free program and some free games and boom, you're able to play games on that system. Plus, if you're a speedrunner or planning to become a speedrunner, almost all of them play on emulators as it's the quickest way to learn. If emulation sounds good to you, but you're still just a bit turned off by the idea of playing with a mouse and a keyboard or a modern controller, then there are plenty of options for you. If you really want the closest thing to the real experience, you could buy USB versions of that system's controller on Amazon. Just take a look. They've got USB versions of pretty much every controller out there. As you can see, emulation is easy to set up and very cost-effective. Just, remember rule number 1 of emulation. Don't talk about emulation. Personally, I never owned a Super Nintendo as I was more of a Sega Genesis guy back in the day. So if it wasn't for the ZSNES emulator, I would never have got to experience any of the SNES classics. My fave had to be the Super Mario RPG. It was so good. Thanks, Emulation.